She was just 15 when they married her off to a mad king, a British princess trapped in the gilded cage of the Danish court where madness ruled and power corrupted absolutely. What began as a desperate search for love would spiral into a scandal so explosive it would topple governments, bankrupt a nation, and change the course of European history forever. This is the story of Caroline Matilda, the queen who dared to love the wrong man and paid the ultimate price. Before we dive into this incredible true story, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, would you risk everything for love? Now, let's go back to 1766, to a palace where nothing was as it seemed.
The carriage wheels clattered against the frozen cobblestones of Copenhagen as 15-year-old Princess Caroline Matilda of Great Britain stared out the frost-covered window. Everything looked gray here, the sky, the buildings, even the faces of the people who had gathered to watch their new queen arrive. She pulled her fur cloak tighter, though the cold she felt had nothing to do with the Danish winter. "Smile, Your Majesty," her lady-in-waiting whispered. "They're watching." But Caroline couldn't smile, not when she was about to meet the husband she'd never chosen, never even seen until their wedding portrait was presented to her 3 months ago. King Christian VII of Denmark, 17 years old. Handsome in the painting, certainly, but the letters from Copenhagen had whispered other things, strange things. The palace loomed before her, massive and imposing, its windows like dark eyes watching her approach. This was Christiansborg Palace, and it would be her prison for the rest of her life. Christian was waiting in the throne room, and when Caroline first saw him, her heart lifted for just a moment. He was beautiful, delicate features, bright eyes, dressed in the finest silks and velvets. He looked like a prince from a fairy tale. Then he spoke. "You're shorter than I expected," he said, circling her like she was a horse at auction. "And your nose is rather large, isn't it? Well, no matter. We must do our duty for the kingdoms." Caroline felt her cheeks burn, but she curtsied deeply. "I am honored to serve Your Majesty and Denmark." Christian laughed, a high, unsettling sound. "Serve? Yes, you'll serve. That's what queens do, isn't it? Serve and breed and smile." He leaned closer, and she could smell wine on his breath, even though it was barely noon. "They say your brother is mad. King George III, locked away in his fits? Is madness in your blood too, little queen?" "My brother is not mad," Caroline said quietly, though her hands trembled. "He is unwell at times." "Unwell?" Christian clapped his hands. "What a pretty word for it. I'm unwell, too, they say. Do you know what the court calls me behind closed doors? The Mad King? Isn't that delicious?" Over the following weeks, Caroline learned the terrible truth. Christian wasn't just eccentric or difficult. There was something genuinely broken in him. He would stay awake for days, pacing the halls and laughing at nothing. He kept prostitutes in his private chambers and spoke openly about his visits to the brothels of Copenhagen. He would strike servants for imagined offenses, then weep and beg their forgiveness moments later. And he refused to touch her. "You're too pure," he told her one night when she waited in her bedchamber, dressed in her finest nightgown as the court physicians had instructed. "Too pure, too royal. It's like trying to make love to a statue. Go away. I'll find my pleasures elsewhere." Caroline lay awake that night, tears streaming silently down her face. She was Queen of Denmark, one of the most powerful women in Europe on paper. But in reality, she was utterly powerless. A teenage girl abandoned in a foreign court, married to a madman who publicly humiliated her. The Danish nobles whispered and watched. The servants pitied her, and Caroline felt herself disappearing, becoming invisible in her own palace. Then, in the spring of 1768, everything changed. King Christian decided he needed a physician, not just any physician, a friend, a companion, someone educated and worldly who could cure his unwellness. The court ministers arranged interviews with several candidates. The man who walked into the throne room that April morning was unlike anyone Caroline had ever seen. He was German, in his 30s, with intelligent eyes and a confident bearing that bordered on arrogance. His name was Johann Struensee, and he carried himself like he'd never bowed to anyone in his life. "You're the doctor?" Christian asked, studying him suspiciously. "I'm a physician, Your Majesty. Whether I'm your physician depends on whether you can tolerate honesty." The room fell silent. No one spoke to the king that way. Caroline held her breath, waiting for Christian to explode. Instead, he laughed, really laughed, with genuine delight. "I like you," Christian declared. "You're hired. Come, let's walk. I want to hear all your radical ideas. They say you're an Enlightenment man, a free thinker. Tell me, do you believe in God?" As Christian and Struensee left the room deep in conversation, Caroline watched them go. She didn't know it yet, but the man who had just entered their lives would change everything. He would become the king's closest confidant, her own secret lover, and the catalyst for a scandal that would shake all of Europe. But first, Caroline would have to survive her loneliness. And in the Danish court, loneliness could be the most dangerous thing of all.
Within months, Johann Struensee had become indispensable to King Christian. He accompanied him everywhere, to council meetings, private dinners, even on a grand tour of Europe that lasted nearly a year. And slowly, subtly, Struensee began to change things. "Your Majesty doesn't need to attend every tedious meeting," he would say. "Sign here, and I'll implement the reforms we discussed. You should be enjoying yourself, not buried in paperwork." Christian, who had never wanted to be king in the first place, was only too happy to agree. He signed papers without reading them, gave Struensee more and more authority, and retreated further into his private world of pleasure and madness. Caroline watched all this from a distance. She'd finally managed to produce an heir, Crown Prince Frederick, born in January 1768, but the pregnancy had been a nightmare, and everyone in court whispered about when and how the child had been conceived, given Christian's notorious avoidance of his wife. After the birth, Christian ignored her completely. At just 17 years old, Caroline had fulfilled her primary duty, and now she was simply there, a decorative piece of furniture in the palace. That's when Struensee noticed her. It started innocently enough. He would bow slightly lower when passing her in the halls. He began attending the small dinners she hosted, contributing intelligent conversation when the other courtiers offered only flattery and gossip. "You seem interested in the reforms Your Majesty's husband is implementing," he said one evening, standing beside her at a palace window overlooking the gardens. "I read," Caroline replied, trying to sound dignified. "I may be young, but I'm not stupid." "No one thinks you're stupid, Your Majesty." Struensee's voice was gentle. "They think you're invisible. There's a difference." Caroline turned to look at him, shocked by his directness. In the candlelight, his face was kind, his eyes genuinely concerned. "I am invisible. I'm a footnote in my own life." "That could change," Struensee said softly, "if you wanted it to." Over the following months, an impossible relationship bloomed. Struensee would bring her books, banned books, revolutionary texts by Voltaire and Rousseau.
They would talk for hours about philosophy, politics, the nature of power and freedom. "You're wasted here," he told her one night when they'd lingered too long in the library. The palace was asleep around them. "You're a brilliant mind, and they've caged it." "I'm a queen. The cage came with the crown." "But what if you could be more?" Struensee moved closer. They were standing dangerously near each other now. "Christian is king. Christian is mad. Everyone knows it. He signs whatever I put in front of him. But a physician guiding policy. The nobles hate it. They're already plotting against me." Struensee's voice dropped lower. "But a physician advising the queen, that's different. That's proper. Expected even." Caroline's heart was pounding. She knew she should step away, call for her ladies-in-waiting, end this conversation, but she didn't want to. For the first time since arriving in Denmark, she felt alive. "What are you suggesting?" she breathed. "That we work together. That we make Denmark into something better, more free, more just. That we use Christian's madness not as a curse, but as an opportunity." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. "And that we stop pretending we don't feel what we feel." The kiss, when it came, felt like rebellion and salvation all at once. Their affair began in secret, conducted in stolen moments and hidden rooms. Caroline blossomed under Struensee's attention. She started attending council meetings, offering opinions, signing documents alongside Christian's erratic scrawl. The courtiers whispered, but with Struensee's backing and Christian's indifference, who could stop her? The reforms came quickly after that. Struensee, now effectively ruling through both the mad king and the love-struck queen, began reshaping Denmark according to Enlightenment principles. He abolished torture, granted freedom of the press, ended serfdom on crown lands, reformed the corrupt court system. "You're moving too fast," Caroline warned him one night in her chambers after they'd made love. "The nobles are furious. They're losing power and wealth with every decree." "Let them be furious," Struensee replied, tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "We're dragging Denmark into the modern age. History will thank us." "History might, but the present wants us dead." She was pregnant again. Everyone knew this child couldn't possibly be Christian's. The king hadn't visited her chambers in over a year. But Struensee's confidence was contagious, and Caroline allowed herself to hope. Maybe they could pull this off. Maybe love and power could coexist. Then came the night of the masquerade ball. The palace glittered with candlelight and music. Caroline wore a domino mask, her pregnancy visible beneath her gown. Struensee stood close to her all evening, no longer even pretending to hide their connection. That's when Caroline saw them. The Danish nobles clustered in a corner, watching her with cold, calculating eyes. The Queen Dowager Juliana Maria, Christian's stepmother, smiled at Caroline from across the room. It was the smile of a predator who just cornered its prey. "Johann," she whispered, gripping his arm. "Something's wrong." But it was too late. The trap was already closing. The question wasn't whether they would strike, but when and how bloody the reckoning would be.
The coup came at dawn on January 17, 1772. Caroline woke to the sound of boots in the hallway outside her chambers, heavy, military boots. She sat up in bed, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward, her heart already racing with premonition. "Your Majesty!" Her lady-in-waiting burst through the door, her face white with terror. "They're arresting everyone. The guards, they've taken Dr. Struensee. They're saying—" The door slammed open. Armed men poured into the Queen's bedchamber, a violation so profound that Caroline couldn't even scream. At their head stood the Queen Dowager, Juliana Maria, dressed in black, her face triumphant. "Caroline Matilda," she said formally,
By order of the king, you are under arrest for adultery, treason, and conspiracy against the crown. Christian would never, Caroline started. Christian signed the order an hour ago. Juliana Maria held up a document covered in the king's shaky signature. He was quite cooperative once we explained how you and your physician had been manipulating him, drugging him, stealing his power while carrying on your disgraceful affair. "Where is Johann?" Caroline demanded, finding her voice. "What have you done with him?" "Dr. Struensee is in chains, as are all his co-conspirators. He'll be tried for treason. The penalty for that, as you know, is death." The world tilted. Caroline gripped the bedpost, fighting the urge to vomit. "No, you can't. I'm the Queen of Denmark. I'm the Princess of Great Britain. My brother—" "Your brother is occupied with his own problems. His madness is worse than ever, they say. And even if he weren't, what could he do? You've admitted your guilt by your reaction. You carry a bastard in your belly. You humiliated Denmark and your husband. You're not a queen anymore, Caroline. You're a prisoner." They took her in the middle of the night to Kronborg Castle, Hamlet's castle, ironically enough, a fortress on a windswept peninsula surrounded by icy seas. They separated her from her children, 3-year-old Prince Frederick, whom she'd barely been allowed to mother, and the tiny Princess Louise Augusta, born just 5 months earlier and clearly not Christian's child. "My babies!" Caroline sobbed as they dragged her away. "Please, let me say goodbye to my babies!" But there would be no goodbyes, no mercy, no second chances. In Copenhagen, the trials began. Struensee and his closest allies were paraded before judges who'd already decided their fate. The charges were extensive: treason, usurpation of royal power, corruption, moral degeneracy. "Did you have carnal relations with Queen Caroline Matilda?" the prosecutor demanded. Struensee, haggard from weeks of imprisonment and torture, lifted his head. For a moment, Caroline heard later, he seemed about to deny it, to try to save her reputation even at the cost of his own credibility. Then he spoke clearly. "I did. I loved her. I love her still. And I regret nothing, except that we failed to make Denmark better before you small-minded fools destroyed everything we built." The courtroom erupted. The confession sealed both their fates. Alone in Kronborg Castle, Caroline received the news in stages. First, that Struensee had been convicted. Then, that his sentence was death by drawing and quartering, the most brutal execution Denmark could offer. Finally, that her own marriage would be dissolved, her title stripped, and she would be exiled from Denmark forever. "They're going to kill him," she whispered to the stone walls of her cell. "Because of me, because we dared to love each other." On April 28, 1772, Johann Friedrich Struensee was led to the execution ground in Copenhagen. Thousands came to watch. They'd loved his reforms once, but now they bayed for his blood, turned by propaganda and the nobility's fury into a mob. Caroline wasn't allowed to attend. She was told about it later, in cruel detail, by a guard who enjoyed watching her grief. Struensee's last words were reportedly, "I've done my best for the good of the kingdom and the happiness of its people." Then they broke him on the wheel, dismembered him, and mounted his head and limbs on pikes as a warning to anyone else who might dare to challenge the established order. The financial crisis that had been brewing during Struensee's rapid reforms exploded in his absence. The old guard, back in power, were corrupt and incompetent. They'd dismantled Struensee's economic reforms out of spite, and now Denmark's treasury was hemorrhaging money. Banks failed, trade collapsed. The Danish economy, which had been stabilizing under Struensee's management, plunged into chaos. But none of that mattered to Caroline. She sat in her cell at Kronborg Castle, staring at nothing, her arms wrapped around her pregnant belly, the child of the man they'd murdered for loving her. Her brother, King George III, finally intervened, not out of family love, but to prevent further scandal. Caroline would be allowed to leave Denmark, but she could never return to England. She would live in exile in Celle, Germany, a small German town, cut off from her children forever. "Your Majesty," her lady-in-waiting said gently, "they're preparing the ship. It's time to go." Caroline stood slowly. She was 20 years old and felt ancient. She took one last look at Denmark through her cell window, at the kingdom she'd briefly ruled, the palace where she'd found love, the country that had destroyed everything she cared about. "I'm not Your Majesty anymore. I'm just Caroline now." But even in exile, her story wasn't quite over. One final twist awaited, a reminder that fate isn't finished with us until we draw our last breath.
The town of Celle, Germany, was pretty in a quiet, forgettable way. Rolling hills, neat houses, peaceful streets. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear from history. That's what they wanted for Caroline. Disappearance. Silence. A forgotten footnote to a scandal that had embarrassed two kingdoms. But Caroline, even in her grief and exile, refused to disappear completely. She arrived in Celle in June 1772, just 20 years old, pregnant and broken. The small palace they'd given her was comfortable but isolated. She was allowed a small household staff, a few loyal servants who'd chosen to follow her into exile, but no visitors of consequence, no correspondence with her children, no news from the Danish court. "They want me to die quietly," she told her lady-in-waiting, Louise von Plessen, one of the few who'd remained loyal. "To just fade away." Louise squeezed her hand. "Then don't. Live. Write. Remember. Keep him alive in your heart." The baby was born that July. Another daughter, though Caroline never officially revealed the father. She named her Louisa, a small defiance, a tiny echo of the name Louise that her executed lover had sometimes called her in their most intimate moments. Caroline wrote letters, dozens of them, to her children in Denmark. Prince Frederick and Princess Louise Augusta were being raised by the same people who destroyed her life, poisoned against her mother with lies about her shameful behavior. "My dearest Frederick," she wrote in a letter that would never be delivered, "you are 4 years old now, and I wonder if you remember me at all. I wonder if they've told you terrible things about your mama. I hope, when you're older, you'll understand that love is not a crime, even when society says it is. I hope you'll judge me not by what I did, but by what I tried to do. Make Denmark better, freer, more just. Your father couldn't do it. He was too broken. But Johann and I, we tried. We really tried." The letter sat on her desk, unsent, like all the others. In Denmark, the chaos Caroline had predicted came to pass. The conservative nobles who'd orchestrated the coup quickly proved why Struensee's reforms had been necessary. They were corrupt, self-serving, and economically incompetent. The treasury continued to bleed. Trade agreements fell apart. The brief flowering of freedom and enlightenment that Struensee had cultivated withered under their rule. "They killed him for nothing," Caroline said bitterly when she heard the news. "All those reforms they undid. Denmark needed them. The economic policies, the legal changes, the freedom of the press. And now they're drowning in debt and corruption again." "History will remember," Louise said quietly. "Maybe not soon, but eventually." Caroline tried to build a life in Celle. She read voraciously,
walked in the gardens, played with her daughters when the grief wasn't too overwhelming. She received occasional visitors, German nobles, curious travelers who'd heard the scandalous story and wanted to see the fallen queen in person. Some days were better than others. Some days she could almost forget the sound of breaking wheels, the image of a head on a pike, the children she'd never hold again. Other days, the grief was suffocating.
Her brother, George III, never visited. He wrote once, a cold letter making clear she'd embarrassed the family and should be grateful for the comfortable exile he'd arranged. Caroline burned the letter and never wrote back. Time passed slowly in Celle. 1773, 1774, 1775. Caroline was still in her early 20s, but felt lifetimes older. Then, in the spring of 1775, she caught a fever. It started as nothing, a cough, some fatigue, but it worsened quickly. The local physicians were baffled. They bled her, gave her tonics, prescribed rest. "I think I'm dying, Louise," Caroline said one evening as her lady-in-waiting sat beside her bed. "Don't say that! You're young! You'll recover!" But Caroline shook her head weakly. "I'm 23 years old, and I'm tired, so tired. I've been tired since Copenhagen, since they took him from me. He wouldn't want you to give up." "I'm not giving up, Louise. I'm just done. I tried to be brave. I tried to make something matter, and they destroyed it all. Maybe this is mercy." Louise von Plessen wept, holding Caroline's hand as the fever climbed higher. On May 10, 1775, just 3 years after her exile began, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, former Queen of Denmark, died in Celle. She was 23 years old. The official cause was scarlet fever, though some historians would later speculate it might have been something more sinister, poison perhaps, from those who wanted to ensure she never told her full story. Her children in Denmark barely remembered her. Prince Frederick grew up to become King Frederick VI, a reformer in his own right who quietly reinstated many of Struensee's policies. Perhaps some echo of her mother's dreams survived in him.
Princess Louise Augusta lived her whole life marked by the scandal of her birth. And the youngest daughter, little Louisa born in exile, grew up never knowing her father's name or the full story of why her mother had died so young and so sad. The financial crisis that followed Struensee's execution lasted for years, damaging Denmark's economy and international standing. Eventually, historians would recognize that his reforms, though implemented too quickly and without enough political groundwork, had been fundamentally sound. He'd been ahead of his time, and he'd paid for it with his life. As for Caroline, she was buried quietly in Celle, far from the palaces and power she'd briefly touched. No grand monument, no elaborate funeral. Just a simple grave for a complicated woman who dared to love the wrong man at the wrong time. But here's what they couldn't bury: the story. Over the centuries, Caroline Matilda's story has been retold again and again, in books, films, plays. People are drawn to it, to this young woman who found love and power in impossible circumstances, who tried to change a kingdom and lost everything. Was it worth it, people ask, imagining her perspective? And if we could hear Caroline's voice from across the centuries, perhaps she'd answer like this: "I was 15 when they married me to madness, 17 when I found love, 20 when they executed the man I loved and exiled me forever, 23 when I died alone and far from home. Was it worth it? I held real power, however briefly. I helped free people from torture and oppression. I loved and was loved completely, even if only for a moment. I lived fully in a world that wanted me to simply exist and breed. So yes, despite the pain, despite how it ended, yes, it was worth it. That's the story of Caroline Matilda, the teenage queen who became a revolutionary, a lover, and ultimately a martyr to her own boldness. If you found her story as powerful as I did, please subscribe to hear more incredible true stories from history. And let me know in the comments, do you think Caroline made the right choice? Could love and power ever have coexisted for her? Or was tragedy inevitable from the start? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.